When we think about hippies, we probably think about long-haired, beautiful people on the west coast of America, or possibly here in London in the swinging 60s. I don't know about you, but I don't think usually of the Soviet Union. Could there have been hippies in the Soviet Union? Was that even possible? In today's episode, we're going to find out if it was. This is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen Coates. The Bureau of Lost Culture is dedicated to unearthing, digging up strange, half-forgotten, half-remembered, lost countercultural stories. And in this episode, I meet with Terje Toomistu, the Estonian film director. Hello, Terje.
Hi.
Now, the reason we're here today, Terje, is because you are in London to talk about your amazing documentary, Soviet Hippies, right?
That's right.
Now, the reason we're interested in it, of course, I mean, amongst other things, well, this is a show about counterculture. And your film really is about the counterculture, the hippie counterculture of the mid to late 60s and 70s and onwards in the Soviet Union.
Yes, basically the hippie movement began as a reaction to the Western hippie movement, so it was in the late 60s. So the earliest music that is in the movie is from 1970. And some songs were perhaps written by the musicians in late 60s, and then they were recorded maybe in 76 when they finally had a chance to record something.
Yeah.
But basically the movement began 66, 67, the first hippies, and then it really went up to the 69. Then it became politicized by the authorities. The KGB was after them around 70, 71, and then the movement was pushed underground. And then there was another kind of revival or when it really exploded into a subculture in its own right, that was in the end of the 70s.
See, it's interesting for us because I think for most people listening is that I don't think they had any idea that there was a hippie movement in the Soviet Union. I mean, and of course your film maybe is, that's why you've made it. It was really a kind of invisible history from this side of what was the Iron Curtain. I think this film that you've made is probably the first film that's been made about it. Is that right?
I think there has been some TV reportages made in Russia, but basically it's the first proper film that explores this movement in depth, and I was working on that for 6 years, and even I didn't know that the hippies existed. I thought that the film's gonna be about these few eccentric individuals who were young in the 60s and who were maybe doing some hippish stuff. But I had to begin with the research, and my other hat is in anthropology. So I used my anthropologist skills of analysis and ethnology and basic oral history approach, because there was no footprint on the official Soviet media about the hippies, of course.
When we were researching the story of the X-ray records made in the Cold War, the bone records, it was the same thing, really. All the official documentation about it obviously was written by the state, so it was propaganda, really. The way to collect that story, the way that we were able to collect it to write the book, was the same method, really. It's oral history. We had to interview people, find people who'd been around and do it. And you do that. I mean, the film is about that. It follows their trajectory. I think that just to go back to that thing about us in the West, or even possibly you in Estonia, not knowing really that there was a hippie movement, that for us is part of this whole invisibility of the Soviet Union. All sorts of things went on in the Soviet Union that we remain still unaware of. And I think maybe we can just explain it a little bit, because you call it Soviet hippies, but really, as far as I could tell in the documentary, it concentrates mainly on Estonia and on Western Russia. Is that right? I mean, into the Soviet Union, of course, 22 states. Was there a hippie movement elsewhere? I mean, in the eastern states and in those distant places from Moscow and Leningrad and Estonia?
Yes, of course. What we concentrated were Estonia, Ukraine, and then Russia, as far as it goes through Petersburg, Moscow, which were very, very central for the movement, and also Smolensk, apparently. So these were the shooting sites, and mainly also for the production issue, and not only financial, but also conceptual, because otherwise it would also become a very, very different story if you cannot tie all these people somehow together. And of course, the most active or the first hippies were in these main Soviet cities, and especially the eastern part, which was much more exposed to the Western influences. And Estonia, like in Estonia, there was also access to Finnish television, and that was an open window to the world, and that also created this distinctive music scene out there. But of course, when the hippies developed their network, then by the late 70s, it was really like a network across the Soviet Union, and then there were hippies also as far as Ufa and even in the Far East. Perhaps they had their small circuits, and then maybe they traveled to meet others in Moscow, and in Moscow there was like a subcultural movement as such. So I think that is the most interesting thing that the hippie movement grew into, was this network of people who were exchanging addresses and names and phone numbers of other hippies.
One of the most the many fascinating things in the film is this kind of proto version of Facebook that they've got going. This sort of written book, haven't they, which lists, if you turn up in this city, these are the people to contact if you want somewhere to crash, as they would have said in the hippie times. And it was this sort of wonderful thing, this directory, this sort of hippie directory, wasn't it?
Yeah, I have even came to think of it as a kind of couch surfing, but that was before internet. But couchsurfing also is based that you have a profile and then you give recommendations to each other, and then you can travel to another city and you can have a free accommodation and ideally friends. But that was then in the Soviet era without internet, so it was very, you had to really write down the names and addresses, and you have to give a recommendation. You had to know somebody who knows that person, that you're trusted, into the system. And they really call themselves Systema, which translates as system. So they really created this alternative system that essentially made them feel free.
Let's listen to a little bit of music. There's a lot of music in the film. And of course, we're going to talk about who made it and how and when it came out in a little while. But let's just listen to this to begin with. That's Magan Sen Ozemi, is that how you pronounce it?
Yes, and that's actually the only song in the movie that is technically not from the Soviet Union. So this is from Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia at the time. But I just personally really love that song for the ages before I got to research the Soviet hippies. And the song is, the title of the song says, Dream of the World, Dream about the world. So in a way, this song holds a promise to me. At least when I listen to it, I feel this promise of another kind of world, another world order, another way of being. And that was very much essential to the Soviet hippies, that they were craving for this imaginary elsewhere, for this different kind of being where people would be kind and nice and loving and wild. That's what they wanted.
Right, not so different, of course, than the hippie dream in the West, of course. And
yes.
I mean, obviously, we're in London now, and in the UK, the impression I get about the hippie movement here was that this is a small country. the UK. So the notion of an elsewhere was a bit more difficult, and it seemed to be situated in some fairyland or something. Whereas, of course, in America, there was a West. There was there's the like in the Soviet Union, these vast distances that you could set off on these journeys. And journeys are part of the thing in your film, isn't it? And that track, it is very dreamlike. It's very innocent and pure, isn't it? It's that side of the hippie dream, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. In the movie, there's also the scene when people are talking that they couldn't even describe it with words what it felt, but there was this contagious feeling that they shared. And many people I've spoken to who were attending some of the first psychedelic rock gigs, for example in Tallinn, they still remember it with very profound sentiments. And think of it, if you are living in a country where all you've been listening to is either the Soviet official music or propaganda, and then some beat bands, then this psychedelic fuzzy sound, it really came like this strange vibration.
Let's just back up a bit. So how did this, was music the way that these values, this hippie dream was communicated from the West? I mean, how did the people who became hippies in Estonia and in Russia and in Ukraine, how did they know about this hippie movement in the West?
Exactly, through music.
Through music.
And the big thing was how to tune your radio on a different wavelength. And then you could listen to a radio such as Radio Luxembourg. The Radio Luxembourg was really legendary among these radio stations, but also there were Radio Free Europe, some Swedish channels, some Finnish channels. And so this really allowed to hear all these great hippie hits from UK, from United States, and that was the source of inspiration. They didn't understand the lyrics, but they just heard this unknown, crazy, mesmerizing sound. And the sound really, like one of the protagonists says, that it made you shake like the strange vibration. And then, of course, the Western records became a big thing for them. They were very expensive, but very often they were bought among a group of friends, or if somebody had a record, then it was borrowed to others who were re-recording it to reel tapes, and then they were exchanged and then re-recorded again and again. So the quality reduced amazingly, and those who had records, they were the popular guys.
Yeah, I mean, we share a friendship, I suppose, for filmic friendship with Kolja Vasin. He's in your film, and he was in our film, actually. Kolja Vasin, for people who don't know him, self-styled the Beatles guy. I mean, he was known until his death fairly recently as the Beatles guy, number one Beatles fan. But when we met Kolja, and I asked him, because he sat there in the temple of John Lennon, the Temple of Love, playing Beatles music, surrounded by, hundreds, if not thousands, of Beatles-related objects. And I said to him, well, Cole, what did the Beatles mean to you? What was it about the music? And he said, it was just one word: freedom. Something about that music spoke to him as a young guy in the greyness of Leningrad, sort of spoke across the Iron Curtain and set him on fire in some way. And as you know, he remained on fire until, sadly, he committed suicide last year. And it was the music that mainly transmitted the message. And the other values of hippiedom, the clothes, the long hair, the drugs, the spiritualism, that was also leaking through those somehow, right?
Yes, exactly. And you managed to get some access to music journals, magazines. You had images that came along with records, the LPs. So these were these small little pieces of information, but they were so potent, they were so big, and of course it created this mimicry of style, long hair, jeans, trying to make your clothes more colorful. You had to maybe rip your curtains off and make yourself a pair of wide, colorful bell bottoms.
Yeah, flared trousers. Yeah, the obligatory uniform of the hippie generation. Also, you said in an article which you wrote about drugs in that time, which is also fascinating, You talk about Stanislav Grof, the psychiatrist, coming to Russia in the early 60s, 1964, bringing with him 300 ampoules of LSD, which obviously was not illegal because nobody knew what it was at the time, and he sort of gave that to university students and stuff, didn't he? And that seems to have, according to your article anyway, seems to have also been the seed of a kind of change of consciousness, which then spread from them outwards. Is that right?
Exactly, and it's just incredible. I heard about it first, I didn't believe it, and then I met Stanislav Grof myself. I asked him myself, and he said that story, and of course he didn't want to draw strong conclusion of it, but he said that a couple of years later, some of his colleagues went to St. Petersburg and realized that the whole atmosphere in the campus have changed. People are reading Hermann Hesse and are suddenly interested in yoga and meditation.
So it was a combination of things then, coming through music mainly, maybe some images from magazines and books, and then this change of consciousness coming through, partly through maybe psychoactive drugs. And
well, actually also in the late 60s, it's incredible, but the Soviet media, official media, was publishing some articles how degenerate are the Western youth. They are taking the strange drugs, LSD, is it the gateway to heaven or hell? These kind of titles. But that was, again, before the movement was politicized. And that, but of course, like the youth were reading it as a source of inspiration. Of course, they knew that, they don't care whether it's a gateway to hell or heaven, but it's kind of cool, like the hippies are doing it.
But I mean, the same articles were being written here. I mean, and in America, the press was full of, horror stories of, people thinking that they were an orange when they're on LSD and peeling themselves, and, these ludicrous stories, scare stories, actually. And of course, right the way back to the 50s, they've been, in Soviet Union and in the West, they've been writing stories in the official press which were denigrating teenagers, and young people, and listening to this awful music and stuff. That was always going on, wasn't it? Both in Soviet Union and here. I suppose the thing which is different for us to understand, and watching your movie and really struck me actually, is that we in the UK or in the US, there was not a repressive regime, right? So however disapproved of you might be for wearing flared jeans or growing your hair or trying out different substances before they became illegal, you weren't much at risk of, arrest and imprisonment, right? But of course, in the Soviet Union, you were, right? It was much more risky in a way, wasn't it, to be different?
That is the main difference. Yeah. One of the main differences is also that the Soviet hippies generally didn't have LSD around,
right?
Which was again very characteristic for the Western hippie movement. But the other one is really that being a hippie was a joyful life that came with all the risks. That meant that if you meet cops on your way, there's about 50-50 chance that you're going to get arrested. Or if you cross the red line, if you say something ideological or you insult the regime, then you might be treated really, very badly in a psychiatric hospital. And basically, like if you were already a hippie, there was no easy return to the normal life. Let's say at some point you thought that, okay, maybe I still want to have a career or have, family or benefits or something, or like travel abroad. Like all these things, all the benefits you got only when you were part of the Komsomol. And of course, no hippie wanted to join the Komsomol.
Komsomol being the communist youth movement. So
Exactly.
To get on, you really had to join that and be a member of the party. So what you're saying is that once you'd stepped outside that, particularly if you'd got some form by having been arrested or having your name noted down, then there was no way back.
Yeah, very, very. Of course, like the hippie movement itself, like we could describe or think of it as a rhizomatic movement. There were those who were like genuinely radically hippies who were really real dropouts from the Soviet mainstream society. And then there were those, like for example in Estonia, we can say that there were those who were, let's say, they were following the hippie ideals, but they, at some point, let's say they were the first generation of hippies in the 60s, they were like fooling around for some couple of years, and then they realized that, this thing got too dangerous. Then they find a way in a thin line between the official and the unofficial. Let's say they find a way to be musicians, composers, artists, designers, something like that. And then maybe in their heart they were hippies, but they didn't show it off. They didn't follow the Sistema traveling, but they were kind of sometimes doing some underground art exhibitions or things like that, but then they still had like a normal career, and they were, of course, very careful all the time, and sometimes took risks, sometimes didn't.
Yeah, so not so different here actually too. There's the hardcore people who sort of, really turned on, tuned in and dropped out. And then there's the people who sort of were halfway in and were able to sort of step back and become successful in some other ways, right? But there were some very poignant scenes in your film, which reminded me again of Kolja Vasin. I remember he told us that he was on the platform of a train station once, and two guys, I think, came up to him and sort of, grabbed hold of his hair and dragged him along the platform by his hair. And these were not, Komsomol youth police. These were ordinary people. And I think that, you make this point, and we came across this too with regard to an earlier generation of like youth culture with the Stilagi, the people who dressed up in sort of American fashions in the late 50s and early 60s. It wasn't just the kind of the authorities that hated them. There was a lot of the kind of ordinary people, possibly through indoctrination, also sort of looked down at them and spat on them, wasn't it? It wasn't just the officials.
Yeah, of course, because like the issue was a moral issue. It was very much about the purity and danger, to cite Mary Douglas famously. So it was really that these kids were considered like degenerate, dangerous for the societal well-being, poisoned by the Western influences, and also there were like some criminals who had some issue with the cops, and then the cops said that, well, if you just kind of take care of the hairy fellows, it's gonna be fine. And then these criminal kind of tough guys were also cutting the hair of the hippies in some instances, and of course there were like bus driver who didn't want to pick up a girl who was having a hippie skirt or a bag or like strange clothing, and then there were of course like these men were like shouting "Caesars, Caesars, Caesars" when some hippies were entering a bar. So there were of course these incidences also coming from the mainstream culture, and it's very much tied to this thing like what is a proper way of being and what is a decadent, dirty.
Which is when propaganda has really been successful, isn't it? When you can turn a population upon itself, when you don't have to police it yourself, because the common people are policing it for you. That's the kind of insidious thing. But speaking of insidious Western influences, let's have a listen to this tune.
This is Radio Luxembourg.
Poppelo vaimne köö!
That's Ornament, Radio Luxembourg. Tell us about that track, Terje.
Well, the person who made the song, who sings there, is Gunnar Krapps, who actually became very famous rock star later on. So that was one of his first bands called Ornament, again a spiritual reference in it. And so this song is about Radio Luxembourg, and it says that it's a spiritual kitchen of pop life.
Love it. We had Vladimir Raevsky in here a couple of months ago, the Soviet journalist, and Russian journalist, and we were talking about Luxembourg and Radio Free Europe and BBC World Service, and he was telling us about the gigantic amount of money that was spent in the Soviet Union trying to jam the radio signals. They built these towers all the way around Moscow, spent like what were the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars attempting to block the music out. They definitely did not like that influence, did they, the authorities?
Certainly, and especially at the beginning of the movement, at the late 60s, early 70s. But then again, it's strange that the first Beatles songs was released already in the late 60s under one Melodia label. It was a compilation track, and it was stated as an English folk song. And then already by mid 70s, Melodia began slowly releasing other Western influential music, and then became a phenomenon of touring rock stars like the Gunnar Graps. So in a way, this ban of the rock music, it is true only for some part of time, because later on it was already more complex. Sometimes your record was released by Melodia, and sometimes you were banned to play. But again, most of these bands, their records were not released in Melodia.
I mean, Vladimir did say, actually, they were much more worried about the speech content of radio. So they were bothered about music too, of course. And, these kind of wild guitar music was an improvisation was seen as unhealthy in some way, in immoral way, as you said earlier. But, of course, they were really concerned about the speech part of the radio
the lyrics.
too. Yeah, the lyrics, but also whatever other speech was going on between songs and stuff, You show in the film as well the amazing adaptability of people in vandalizing stealing parts from telephone boxes to adapt their acoustic guitars to make them electric, and stealing. We met somebody recently in
You
Russia.
gotta be creative.
You've got to be creative. We met somebody recently in Belarus who they used to steal the sort of PA system which you'd get on the train stations. The speakers on the train stations. They'd steal those to make amplifiers, steal bits from telephone booths to make the guitars electric, and they even vandalised the school piano to take the strings out to put on his bass guitar. Made his guitar into a bass guitar.
And they also built their own synthesizers.
Right.
And they were developing all kinds of crazy mechanisms to create effects on the sound. So people were very, very creative, and of course the main issue for the musicians of the Soviet era was lack of instruments and lack of recording possibilities. It was really like what we have now remained, what I was able to use in the movie or release as a soundtrack of the movie. These were some of the miraculous founds. It was really like somebody had a relative somewhere or connection somewhere, and then they managed to get, let's say, one night in a radio or one night somewhere to record it, and then this album was never officially released, but at least we have the tapes.
Yeah, and there's a lot of great music in the film, and of course you have released that wonderful soundtrack record. There's just a couple of copies on vinyl left. It's great stuff. Let's turn to something a bit darker, though, Terje, because the other thing which really stood out for me in the film is that, like, in the West, there were some leaders sort of emerged in this hippie movement, and this character, Sonny, was one of them. And maybe you could tell us about Sonny, because it's a rather tragic story in a way, isn't it? But he was very interesting as a character and sort of charismatic. What happened with Sonny? What was his story?
Well, he was one of the first leaders in Moscow emerged in the late 60s. And that was the moment when the hippie movement was not yet politicized. It was not, the KGB was only beginning to get after them. And so the youth, in a way, had hopes that they can create the space within the Soviet regime. They didn't really want to overthrow the system at the time. They thought that maybe it's still possible, that we can find a way within the system. And then they thought of doing their first public demonstration in Moscow. A couple of thousand hippies came together on the 1st of June. They had their slogans of "Make love, not war." And as soon as they got there, they got the permission for the demonstration. And the Sunny, Solnce in Russian, or the Sunny, so he was the leader, and he managed to get the permission. And then a couple of thousand kids came together, and the KGB buses were already waiting.
And I think the important thing is that he had got permission, which seems extraordinary, but he got permission because it was going to be an anti-Vietnam War demonstration. In other words, it was anti-US government, wasn't it?
It was aligned with the Cold War politics. Yes,
right.
It was a good goal. But in a way, the hippies thought that it didn't really matter what it was about. It was also about showing that they are doing something and they are there, and it was a manifestation in a way that, hey, we are hippies and we are going out on the streets. And but of course, we cannot really tell what was the real deal there. But I also suspect that the permission was given already with the idea, okay, so this is a great chance that we can get all the social parasites, all the dangerous element of the society together, take down their addresses and names, and then we have an overview. Who are the bad kids? And that basically was what happened. And then they were visited by the KGB agents, and the guys who got a invitation to serve armies, or there were threats from a university side. So all these kind of like silent repressions, and that meant that after that many kids were like, oh, that's too risky. I'm not going to deal with that.
Right.
And that was the moment when, this incident led to this radicalization of the hippies, and it went more underground, and it was also more drug driven, less talk about politics, less intellectual, but more like just get away from everything political, get away from the society, so that the society wouldn't disturb us and we wouldn't just disturb the society.
Because it was very risky, and you got put in prison, and I think you mentioned one person that was in prison that killed himself when he was in prison. And but what about Sonny? Just to finish off his story, what happened then for him?
I mean, of course, like again, we cannot like really tell exactly, but the next summer he was coming to Tallinn, and he stayed one of my hippie friends there, and he's been telling that like he was a little bit like depressed or disappointed and kind of ashamed as well, because he felt that it was his fault that all this thing ended so badly, and he began drinking.
Mm-hmm.
And he was drinking a lot, and then other people who I met him have told me that yes, like they saw him in the end of the 70s, and he was just bumming some money and completely drunk and no respect, and then of course the younger generation of hippies forget about him, and then he died in a hospital unknown.
Mm. He wasn't the only leader, though, was he? And there's another fascinating character in the film, because the other big part of hippiedom, I suppose you call it, in the West, was the spiritual aspects of it. The New Age, the Age of Aquarius, looking to the East, as in India and stuff, for spiritual guidance and spiritual inspiration. And there's at least one guru who you show in the film. Tell us about him. He's fascinating.
Michael Tam, or Sri Rama Michael Tam. His story is another book in itself. I think he was Estonian born who left Estonia in the 30s, got his education in the West, and then at some point he had a spiritual turn, and he decided to go to live in India in an ashrama. But before he wanted to go by what was now Soviet Union, Soviet Estonia, to say goodbye to his relatives. And as soon as he entered across the border of the Soviet Union, he was arrested. And he didn't want to accept the Soviet citizenship. So basically he remained kind of imprisoned as a person without citizenship inside Estonia. And he was forced to live somewhere in the countryside far from the cities. And then in the middle of the 70s, after he had already developed his philosophical, spiritual theories, written some materials down, and all his theories about meditation and zero meditation and how to meditate a black hole that would like suck away something that the hippies later used as to fight the KGB with magic, basically. So the hippies discovered him in 1975, and then he became very popular. A lot of hippies were traveling to see this very spiritual, very strange guy with good aura. That's what people have been telling. And he was a practitioner. So they were doing a lot of yoga and meditation, and he had some followers, some disciples, until finally these disciples managed to get him out of the country. And that was in the early 80s. And then eventually he died in Boston.
He went to America, yeah. But so he developed his theory or his spiritual tradition or whatever it was from what? I mean, how did he become this guru? If he wasn't allowed to leave the country and travel to seek the masters in the East.
They say that he was fluent in Sanskrit.
Right.
Yeah, he was very, very intelligent person. So I don't know exactly what was his background as he arrived in Soviet Union, but he already knew plenty, and he wanted to dedicate himself to spiritual path and wanted to travel to India. So probably he was stuck there, but he had plenty of literature to work with, and he began developing his own theory that is really detached from other traditions of philosophy, his own science systems, and basically his core idea was this zero meditation. But when we have the film screening in October 23 that you're all very welcome to attend in London, then Vladimir Wiedemann, who was his closest disciple, gonna be there, and he can really tell much more what was the core idea of the Michael Tam's theory. But I think the craziest thing is really that they were meditating to create this kind of black hole, like in the cosmos, this negative energy to suck away the power of the KGB. So maybe it's always good to think like why the Soviet Union collapsed. So maybe it was just because these crazy hippies were meditating under a spiral with a crown somewhere in the woods of Estonia and created this black hole that took the power of the KGB away.
I'm buying it. I mean, for sure. I mean, may have been one of the things, wasn't it? I mean, in the way that music was one of the things that we've often asked this. What was the role of music in the end of the Soviet era and perestroika? And it seems to have been brought to an end by many things, and part of it was music and people gathering and pressure from all sides. So people meditating in the woods and imagining a black hole into which the KGB was tumbling. I'll buy that.
Yes, and it's also it's one of these very narrow look at the late Soviet era that like everybody were like brainwashed by propaganda. No, there were a lot of alternative milieus, a lot of kind of scenes near the universities, in the woods, in the intellectual scenes in the cities. Cafe culture developed. Rock concerts. So there were all these kind of scenes that actually created this double publics that historians have been speaking, that there were what you can say in the media or out on the street and what you can actually speak about in the cafes or in the kitchen.
Speaking of rock concerts, let's have a listen to this. That's brilliant. Cherry Garden of Jimi Hendrix, Yuri Morozov. Tell us about that one.
Well, Yuri Morozov is definitely a person who is underestimated in the Soviet Russian music history. He was this guy who worked in a Melodia in St. Petersburg, and he was recording amazing stuff from late 60s throughout the 70s. And he recorded himself. He played all the records himself, and he never released that stuff. And then only later on, like people have been discovering what kind of amazing stuff he created, and that is this album from 1972, and that's very, very hippie spirit. And so Cherry Garden of Jimi Hendrix, of course, like the lyrics go, that Jimi Hendrix is actually not dead, like he's like he rose up from the ashes, and so it has like this absolutely amazing hippie spirit. And later on, towards the late 70s, he was creating this very experimental electronic music. Also really, really cool. And
Also
we have one
brilliant, yeah.
track in the movie as well.
Yeah, amazing stuff. Funny enough about Jimi Hendrix Isn't Dead. When we were with Kolja Vassin and, he said, I want to show you my family album, which, as you'll know, a traditional thing in Russia, isn't it? With photographs of your parents and uncles and grandfather and aunt and stuff. And I was interested to see it because of his long-suffering mother. I put up with Collier spending all his lunch money on Beatles records on X-ray. But he got the book out and opened it up, and I was expecting to see his dad and his mum, but it was all pictures of the Beatles, mainly John Lennon. And in the middle, it said, the big page in the middle, which said, John Lennon, my dad. Obviously, he didn't really think that John Lennon was his father. It was in a metaphorical sense, but I didn't really know what to say. So I just said to him, hey, Collier, you must have been absolutely devastated when he died, And he looked at me and said, he's not dead. And Paul and I were like, oh, okay. And he said he's living in northern Italy, putting albums out. And he pointed at his top shelf. And he had about 8... CDs, which he said were music that Lennon had been releasing over the years from his hideaway in northern Italy. So I said, can we hear one? And he got one CD down and he put it on and played a track, and guess what? Sounded exactly like John Lennon. Anyway, there we go. So another crazy story. But let's just talk, in terms of craziness, Terry, about drugs. We were talking about acid, LSD, before. But in your article, actually, I love that article which you wrote about drugs at the time. And there were some very strange drugs being taken, weren't there? Because, and I think in the film, actually, one of your main characters, I can't remember his name, but he talks about these asthmatic cigarettes. There were these cigarettes that you could buy. Sounds bizarre, doesn't it? To help cure your asthma. And they had a way of sort of adapting them, didn't they, to make this psychoactive substance. Just tell us about that.
So these cigarettes had various psychoactive plants in it. And so the hippies somehow discovered, we don't know exactly how, but somebody discovered that, if you make a tea out of the cigarettes, you buy a package, boil it into a tea, then it becomes a very hallucinogenic tea. And there was this one crazy, very, very strong, tall, big, wild hippie guy called Viking in Tallinn. And I don't know why exactly, how come it's possible, but maybe it was possible because it was just the wild Soviet era that he didn't tell Aare that this is a hallucinogenic tea. So they were drinking tea, and then at some point, I think it was basically a crazy overdoses, and at some point, Aare felt that his lungs were stuck, and I don't know, he almost died. And he also has, of course, this amazing psychedelic hallucinogenic trip that he still remembers in great detail. And he was telling me this story, and the story was actually half an hour long. In the movie, 3 minutes. But yeah, he remembers everything about it, and in a way it was a life-changing moment for him as well, because later on he started having real issues with his lungs. And now he has this very rare disease that nobody really knows why and how, but basically his lungs are shrinking. And so we had a really hard time when we were filming it, but he managed to come out and at least trying to join the journey with other protagonist hippies to Moscow on a hippie bus. But he had to turn back because he was not able to do the whole journey physically. And then after that, he was 2 years, didn't leave his room. His body is already so weak. Last spring, he was in a hospital. He, had a very, very critical moment, but I think all his friends and our Facebook followers were praying for him, and he made it. He's still alive, but he's physically very, very weak, but it's mentally very sharp.
It's quite painful in the film, actually, because he's using these tubes to breathe through, isn't he? And stuff. So that wasn't connected, surely, with that experience that he had early on with the asthmatic cigarettes, was it? Or could it have been caused by that?
I mean, nobody can really tell, but that was the way he presented it to me, and I think it's one of the possibilities that he had this shock in the lungs, some trauma, and then all these things were slowly developing later.
He certainly describes his trip in vivid detail. You're there with him as he's stepping down the staircase slowly outside. And other drugs. I mean, cannabis easy to get hold of, right? That seemed to be very, very easy to get hold of weed.
Yeah, I mean, it was not around as much as maybe in some cities today, but it was around, and it was grown in some regions in the Soviet Union, and then the travelers were bringing it over, and it was shared among friends. And so that was the thing, of course. But then there were like some crazy psychonauts who were also sniffing a cleaning detergent called Sopals that was produced in Riga, and they just discovered it somehow, and it became this cult thing in the late 70s to sniff this cleaning detergent that has an active ingredient of ether. And and some people say that, oh yeah, like that was like as good as acid or even better. Yeah.
It's absolutely amazing, isn't it? Is that how do people discover these things? Does somebody just go around sniffing stuff? I'm just going to go around my house, I'm going to take things out of the cupboard, I'm going to sniff them and see what happens. Yeah. But I mean, how did somebody discover that licking a particular toad gives you a psychedelic experience? Did you just go around licking things? And
I can imagine that there's like some colors in a plant or like this amazing colorful frog, but like the bottle of Sopals, like Soviet design, red. I don't know.
Why would you sniff that? Yeah, exactly. And then of course opium and heroin. Tell us a little bit about that, because you get the poppy fields in the East, don't they?
Yes, and that's like Vladimir Wiedemann, in his memoir book, describes very vividly that hippies discovered the poppies, and then next to the Lenin's statue, there was very few poppies this year, and then the next year there was no poppies at all, because hippies had collected all the poppies and used it to make tea, and some of them were also injecting the tea, and that was also very dangerous. Many people lost their friends because of that, because it was very difficult to settle the right doses. And I think like my take on that is really that it was also all related to this politicization of the movement, because like it made the movement much more radical, because the people just lost hope that there's no point in talking to the regime or participating, or there was no point in active intervention. It was rather that we just want to get out of this society as far as we can, and then of course drugs was one of the ways to create this alternative world. And if you have lost hope in the society, then you just do what you do and what others are doing, and you get high, and then you die. Yeah,
well, particularly with opiates, it's a sort of way to just escape. And you can imagine, I mean, much more so than in the West, how it would feel, how tempting that would be to withdraw, because it was dangerous to engage, and also, what chance did you have of making change? It was limited, so I can definitely see how people would want to withdraw. I suppose that's the other big thing about hippiedom in the West, was that it gave birth to a lot of political movements. I mean, the feminist movement really emerged from that. The ecology movement, emerged from that. Various technological things like Apple computers and stuff also came out of that. So, what about that? Was there anything that really started to change in terms of societal thinking? As a result of the hippie movement in the Soviet Union?
Well, definitely the mainstream youth culture embraced the Soviet hippie style. And that is really strange. The late 60s, the long hair on boys was a real matter for police, that people were forcefully cutting their hair, and there were like newspaper articles about how long hair can you have. And then a couple of years later, mid-70s, you look at the picture in the classroom of high school kids. All the boys have longer hair. And also the hippie-style pants, the jeans, the Beatles. It grew into a huge Beatlemania, attracting much wider circuit of people than those who were hippies or identifying with hippies. All the Komsomol kids were listening to Beatles like crazy. So, and it also had an influence on arts, music that I mentioned, animation, amazingly psychedelic animation was made in the 70s in Estonia and as well as in Russia, and so I think like it had this vast influence on the culture.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good point, because I mean if you look at the way that Kruger's magazine covers changed in the 70s, they became really psychedelic, and there's those, as you said, there's those amazing psychedelic animations in the Soviet Union, weren't there too? Really trippy stuff actually, and King Zazar and stuff like that. Very strange things. So it did start to infiltrate into the culture in a much more wide way, didn't it?
And of course, with animations, it's just also because that was the safe medium. That was where you were allowed to go wild, because that was for children. So you can play around, you can fool around. So many artists were expressing their psychedelic sensitivity in the children's book illustrations, for example. And if you look at the Soviet children's book, they are incredible.
Absolutely amazing, yeah. We love them. And I think also, as time was going on, I always like to remind people of this, is that in many ways, of course, Soviet society was much more advanced than it was in the West. I mean, for instance, for women in some ways, women, went to university, they worked in industry, there were lots of women scientists in the Soviet Union, which was not really true in the West, actually. There was in some respects a much more progressive attitude towards, say, gender. One of the projects we've been involved in, which is releasing the music of Mikhail Televediev, and he scored a TV series in the early 70s called Olga Sergeevna, and Olga Sergeevna is a marine biologist. And I cannot imagine, I'm sure there was no TV series made about a woman marine biologist in the West. That just wouldn't have happened, So it isn't quite as straightforward as everything was much more sophisticated and progressive in the West, and it wasn't that way in the Soviet Union. That's not true, is it?
Yeah, that is a very interesting point about gender, because really officially they were empowering women, but then again, when you look in depth, of course, it was a very misogynist society, and all the people, the party leaders were obviously always men.
True.
And so this to say that there was a great gender equality, it's a half true.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, of course, all the politicians were all men, right?
Yeah.
Terry, let's have one more track.
Kes kurat see ütles, et elu on praht ja inimesed sead. Too asi pole hoopiski nii, vaid statistika andmetel tean, et ainult iga kolmas neist on valmis mind petma. Iga neljas maha müüma, iga seitsmes paljaks varatama. Iga kümnes mu naist üle lööma, 26 mind lihtsalt tapma, 48-s pool ahviks ning orjaks kuulutama.
So that was Statisleen Lesu. Is that the right way to pronounce it?
Yes, the band is called Suk. It's a band from Tartu, from Estonia, and that song was written already in the late 60s. That's what I've heard from the band members. But their record, they have a whole unreleased album that they managed to record within 1 day session in a radio bus that happened to travel from Tallinn to Tartu, and then they had this 1 day there and they recorded this whole album, and that is one of the songs that I love so much. And the singer is also Alexander Müller, who was this very central poetic a guy who was throwing wild parties in his place. He had a piano there, and people were smoking and dancing and partying. So it was like a very this kind of bohemian intellectual center that occurred around him. And he was this charismatic poet who was the lead singer. And the song is Statistilina, which is basically kind of critiquing the I think the bureaucratic and militaristic Soviet world. It was a technocratic state still.
Yeah. I mean, and it's from the album, which is the soundtrack to your film, Soviet Hippies. Brilliant record. And just tell us about the film then. So how long did it take to make, and what actually got you going? Why did you make that film?
Like I mentioned before, that I was, I also didn't know about the hippies, but I had my own hippie time when I was traveling in my early 20s in South America, and I was robbed, and then I had to survive, and then I met these hippies, and so I had like something in my spirit about the hippies. Already when I was teenager, I loved Jim Morrison and their Led Zeppelin and the Doors, and I was having my, dad's jeans and made some colorful butterflies on them. So I was definitely like this rebellious bohemian kid as a teenager already, and then in my master's studies, I became interested in memory culture, and that's where I was like curious. That how come like we don't know much about the alternative stories of the Soviet era, and I realized that there's a very intellectual and also reasonable reason that we had to deal with the trauma first. We had to speak about the crazy Stalinist trauma, what we were not allowed to speak in the 80s, or at least early 80s. And so, of course, in the 90s, we were only talking about this bad stuff that was happening in the Soviet Union, but we were not telling the stories of resistance, of creativity, of imagination, of counterculture. And of course, there was no trace about the Soviet hippies. So, like when we first approached the funders to make this movie, then my producer was insisting that there needs to be somebody who tells in the trailer that yes, I was a hippie, because nobody believed that they were hippies, even though they lived in the Soviet era, because they also didn't know that this movement existed. Nobody knew. I mean, only those knew who were inside the movement, basically. Or you had some very vague, maybe memory that, yeah, you once saw some weird guy somewhere. But like there was no, information. But then Vladimir Wiedemann had published his memoirs, so that protagonist who lives now in London. And so that book blew my mind, and then I became interested in that, and I began with the movie. It was 6 years to do it, 1.5 years of editing, because editing was very, very tough to put all these different generations, different locations, different stories together to have this like film that holds together, because there were so many ways I could go, and we had to test everything, and finally I still settled with this mostly with the power relation story.
Yeah, I mean, and that's very poignant in the film, of course, because it's then and now, isn't it? And there's still this wonderful meet-up on every June the 1st. I guess that's the anniversary of this famous protest where the KGB arrested everybody, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. Like all the, I mean, in Moscow there are still like a couple of hundreds people going to get there on the 1st of June in the park to play around, being celebrating hippie life once a year. But they don't know about this 1st of June arrest in 1971. So this kind of link has disappeared. But they say that since late 70s, somehow they began gathering on the 1st of June. Maybe these people who came there on the 1st of June in 1978, maybe they knew the link, but then later on this link disappeared, but the tradition remained. And so in that film we built this connection, and maybe it's true.
I hadn't thought of it the way you described it there, but these forgotten memories, this repressed memories in some ways, maybe that the difficulty and the darkness of the Soviet times has to be dealt with first before you can properly remember and recollect these stories. Terje, when and where can people see your amazing documentary, film, movie, expose, Soviet hippies? How can they see it?
That's a good question. Of course, the film is still kind of touring the festival or events, but it's kind of winding down also a little bit. So basically, we are open for invitations.
Great.
If you want to organize a screening wherever you are, give us an email and we'll figure it out.
How do they find you? How do people find you?
Well, soviethippies.com is the website. There's also a Facebook group, and my personal email is terjetoomistu@gmail.com.
Well, let's finish with this track, Vantarel by Julgus? Maybe you can tell us about that.
So this is probably or supposedly the first psychedelic rock band of the Soviet Union. Of course, we cannot tell entirely, but this band was active in 1970. A little bit over a year, because the band was considered too strange, too dangerous, and they were invited to the red carpet for some serious talk, so the Soviet red carpet. And but this song is Julgus, which is basically to be brave. It's about stepping out of the box and doing what you gotta do. So I think it's a really it's a hippie anthem for sure.
Terry, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Oled sa näinud, et tantsitakse tänaval? Suudelnud neidu, kes äkki nõnda armas sul. Ei, joomlavaid tehakse nii, muidu puudub julgus teha, mis mõtled. Puudub julgus teha, mis mõtled. Puudub julgus teha, mis soovid sa.
Well, that's it. The strange story of Soviet hippies. We'll be back next time with more lost, forgotten, half-remembered countercultural stories. This was the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen Coates. You can check us out at bureauoflostculture.com. Thanks for listening.